Thank you for that very kind introduction. I'm extremely glad and grateful to have a chance to come down to the National Postal Museum and talk, because I'm from Washington, D.C., actually, but all the talks I give about the Boston Post Road are between New York and Boston, so I get to come down and speak to some friends and family here today, and it's a great honor. I hope to show everyone how America's first mail route, of course that was the Boston Post Road, how it was formed, and also how it continued to influence transportation in the United States up to pretty much the present day. Here we see a map, an outline of the overall Boston Post Road. As you see, it forms two branches. If you're looking, the way I like to describe it is that if you're looking at it from above, as we are here, pretty much resembles a lasso tossed from New York toward Boston, with its knot landing on New Haven, Connecticut, and the hoop of the road wrangling southern New England. In colonial times, it went up the east side of Manhattan, followed the coast of Long Island Sound through Connecticut until it reached New Haven, home of Yale, and then split two ways there. One way continued along the coast of Connecticut, went through Rhode Island and up through Providence and on into Boston from the south. The other way is the northern or inland branch, which broke off New Haven, went north toward Hartford, followed the Connecticut River till it reached Springfield, Massachusetts, where it veered east, continued on into Boston that way. Here we see a close-up of the Boston end of the road. This is a map from 1722, so still very early in the road's existence. But as you see here, it is still marked at this time as the only road leading on to the peninsula of Boston. Today they call it Washington Street, and if you see the highlighted route here, came to an end pretty much where Washington and State Streets meet today. What's interesting about this map, if you look closely, is that the neck of Boston that this lone road followed is not as thin and narrow as it was during this day, not even close. It's been filled in since then, and we know it now as Back Bay. Here is a map of the Manhattan end of the Post Road. Again, this is a map from just before the Revolution. And as you see, the Boston Post Road began at the very southern tip of Manhattan at a fort that the British held there. Today it's a U.S. Customs House. And it went up along what today is known as Bowery Lane. And even then, only a couple miles up the island on this map clearly indicates we still think of this route as the road to Boston. Now what's particularly interesting about this map is that if you see here, this road, this very straight road that cuts off the Boston Road and then comes to a halt, well, that's Broadway. Broadway very clearly ends on this map. And as I explain in one section of the book with a couple simple twists of fate, Broadway could have been Boston Road, or I guess the other way around. Boston Post Road could have ended up being Broadway, and as a result would have been, of course, much more well-known and much more famous, perhaps the most famous, American street. Didn't happen that way, however, which is a shame, because I could really use the royalties. But still, even though the Post Road is not the most famous street in America, a lot of famous Americans did come into contact with it during the course of its history. Washington failed to properly defend the Boston Post Road during the Battle for Manhattan Island in September of 1776. The British approached from Long Island, and it was Washington's task to keep them from claiming the Post Road, because it was the, like I mentioned, main avenue on Manhattan, really the only one that ran from north to south. But Washington didn't place the right men in the right spots to prepare for the attack. The British took the road, and they also took the island. They inhabited it. They occupied it for the duration of the war. And some generals felt that if the British had acted a little more swiftly, they could have defeated the Americans that day. Lincoln went on a speaking tour in several towns along the Boston Post Road in 1860. He took the New Haven Railroad that paralleled the Post Road closely, spoke in many of these towns, and in many ways you can consider this the speaking tour that clinched his presidency, because he didn't give any more speeches after this tour until he was elected president. Franklin Roosevelt received in 1931, when he was governor of New York before he was president, he received a proposal, the first real true genuine proposal for an expressway. And it came to him from an engineer from Stamford, Connecticut, a man who absolutely hated the Boston Post Road, found it completely unsuited to traffic of that time, came to FDR with this proposal. Again, in 1931, we were talking 25 years before the Interstate Highway Act that we generally think of as the plan that laid out America's expressways. Well, 25 years before that, the Boston Post Road inspired this plan for the expressways, and this engineer and FDR nearly got this proposal passed. They took it all the way to Congress, where it died, actually at the last moment, defeated by railroad interests, which is quite a role reversal for the way things happen today. Today, roads and highways are completely preferred to railroads, but it didn't happen that way there.
Others, Barnum, Morgan, John Adams, also came into contact with the road, but I'm going to talk more about the lesser-known figures because I think they serve as a better metaphor for what's really become a lesser-known road. It's an overlooked American icon, if you will. And the first important lesser-known figure is a man named John Winthrop, Jr. He was the colonial governor of Connecticut, and he actually served as governor longer than anyone in the colony or the state's history. He was an amateur scientist. The telescope he used actually became Harvard's first official scientific apparatus. He was also a physician as well. He made colonial house calls. He kind of scoured the Northeast and had about 300 patients. He was his father is much more famous. Massachusetts Bay Colony Governor John Winthrop came over in the Mayflower. But the father was initially loath to the idea of coming to the New World, and it was actually the son who tried to push him in that direction. His shoe size, in case you're interested, was 11, which at that time actually made his shoes very large to fill. Thank you, appreciate that. In these large shoes, Winthrop often walked the Boston Post Road, but it wasn't the Boston Post Road at this time. It was actually a series of Indian trails. And this is a shot of the Post Road remnant in Brookfield, Massachusetts, about as close as you're going to get to seeing the Post Road the way Winthrop and other colonists would have seen the Post Road. Now, the way they maintained the road in those days was they would burn the leaves here in the bush and the bramble, and they called this bush burning, the Indians did, or at least that was the Dutch term for it. This same process, when the new growth would begin to spring up after this burning, animals would come to the path and they would eat the new growth, and this would tamp down the trail even more over time. Often these Indian trails ran right alongside rivers and lakes, and this was done for refreshment and fishing access for the travelers. There's one colonial traveler who called New England's rivers absolutely the best water in the world, and he said he even preferred it to bad beer, but he would not drink it for good beer. Often the road, of course, being an Indian path, went through Indian villages, and sometimes the travelers would even bunk in wigwams, and one colonist named Daniel Gookin called them as warm as the best English houses. Which I don't know what that really says about English houses. In 1645, Winthrop makes an absolutely unprecedented overland tour of these Indian trails that I talked about. He started on what was called the Connecticut Path, which led you outside of Boston toward Connecticut. He cut onto the Bay Path, which led you through Springfield, Massachusetts. As he looped around the early trails, he came up through the Pequot Path, which ran through the Pequot Indian Territory through Providence. While he was in Providence, he actually slept in the house of Benedict Arnold, which was the great-grandfather of the trader Benedict Arnold. And make it a little easier for you there. But Winthrop's trip, it was a terribly grueling trip. It took him about a month. It was freezing temperatures. He slept under beds of grass, blankets of grass. He would fall into rivers sometime. Once he wrote in his diary that he almost fell into or got snagged by an Indian trap. It was just very difficult to travel by land during this period, which is what makes this journey so extraordinary. And while he was on the road here, Winthrop got to get a glimpse of the way these early Indian trails really had an impact on colonial settlement and colonial life. He got to see meeting houses. Usually a meeting house in colonial New England was the most important building in a town. It was their church. It was the civic core, really, of the community, and it was usually built right along these old trails. Now, there were laws saying you actually can't build your residence more than a half mile or so from the meeting house. Again, this was to kind of knit the tight community that the Puritans had been lacking in England. So what you had was you really see civilization kind of pull westward along the trail. You have the meeting house crop up, and then the houses, the residential houses next to it, and you can kind of see settlement begin to flourish. Winthrop also saw taverns. Taverns were the only place a traveler could spend the night. Put your horse up there in the stable. You get a room. But more importantly, it was the only place you could buy alcohol in town in colonial New England. As such, colonial courts often convened there because they liked to have a drink while they were passing their laws, even though it's kind of ironic that they usually pass temperance laws there in a tavern. But Winthrop got to see these as well when he was in Hartford. He stayed at the tavern of Thomas Ford. He also saw early road work. Now, in colonial New England, the way they maintained their highways was they had one or two highway surveyors per town. This position was it was an exalted position. It was very important. It was up there with tax gatherer. It was up there with constable. And the way you kind of ran the highway maintenance at the time was you had the right, these highway surveyors, to once or twice a year call on every able-bodied man in town to come out and do whatever they could, kick the bigger twigs to the side of the road, remove the big rocks. This was the highway maintenance system of the colonial era. But Winthrop got to see that in action as well. He also saw markets, specifically in Providence. He saw Roger Williams Market. Often, livestock and wagons full of produce and other wares would be dragged down these Indian trails. In Boston, for example, the market was right on Washington Street. Like I said, that was the end of the post road. It would be a weekly market, and so you could kind of see commerce begin to flourish as well in Winthrop's day. He also got to see mail. This is because in 1638, the colonists had asked the throne to authorize the postal system. They had been denied, actually, by King Charles. They called it so useful and absolutely necessary, but he refused to pay for it. So in 1639, a Boston man named Richard Fairbanks started to take the mail in himself. He did this at his tavern at the end of the post road. Again, his tavern was just off the foot of Washington Street, and he decided to collect letters there before they were sent overseas. So taken all together, the 1645 journey of Winthrop was really gave him a clearer picture of inland travel and way of navigating land transportation through the Northeast than anyone else had at the time. This would be very important because a couple decades later, he would team up with another cartoon here. This is Governor Francis Lovelace of New York, and they would come together to design the first American postal route. Now, Governor Lovelace, this was really his obsession, actually, and his consultant was Winthrop, who knew more than anyone else, as I said, about inland travel. It was Lovelace's idea to start the mail. He wanted to, of course, stimulate communication, but he also wanted to boost the economy. And actually, believe it or not, maybe the most important aspect of this mail route was to fortify the region, to keep its defenses strong against attack. Lovelace frequently feared a Dutch attack at this time. So the idea was the post rider would go from New York to Boston inside of a month. It would be 2 weeks there, 2 weeks back. He left January 22nd, 1673. We know that he didn't make it there 2 weeks there and 2 weeks back because it took him 2 weeks just to get to Hartford. And when he was in Hartford, he changed his horse, and he also consulted with Winthrop about the best way to make it into Boston. And now, in his initial plan, idea to Winthrop, Lovelace writes, "It would be much advantageous to our design if you discourse with some of the most able woodmen to make out the best and most facile way for a post, which in the process of time would be the king's best highway." He writes this just before the first post rider leaves, and it's a very important distinction on Lovelace's part, because all major roads, all official roads at that time were called King's Highways. You'll still see roads in Connecticut and New York and probably even Pennsylvania with the name King's Highway, and that's because all roads then were King's Highways. But Lovelace is saying this particular route that's going to carry the first American mail is not just a King's Highway, but the King's Best Highway. Now we've come to think of postal workers, unfairly or not, as overweight, lazy, basically like Newman of Seinfeld. But America's very first post rider was actually nothing like Newman at all. He was ordered to be active, stout, and indefatigable. I'd like to see Newman even spell indefatigable. He had to mark trees, as the exhibit out here, the excellent exhibit, shows. He had to cut through a bit of trees because the trail would be, it would disappear, for example. Imagine a snowfall in late January in New York. It's not hard to imagine at all. And when this happened, it was very hard to continue on the trail sometimes. So by marking the trees, you kind of outwitted nature a little bit. He had to escort fellow travelers, anyone he saw along the way, because if you were uninitiated along the route, you really had very little chance of making it where you wanted to go. He had to scout locations for inn, and believe it or not, he even had to, if he saw any, apprehend fugitives. You see Newman getting angrier and angrier at all these things he has to do. We don't know what the first post rider's name was, but we think it might have been, I think it might have been Edward Messenger. And that's because there is a letter that still exists, written in the spring of 1673, just a couple months after the first rider makes his journey. And it's written by Winthrop, and he writes about the return of Edward Messenger from Boston. He's coming back with letters from Boston's governor, the Massachusetts governor, John Leverett, who would have been the recipient of the official mail anyway. So it looks like very possibly this person, Mr. Messenger, was the very first post rider's name, or at least it's a good clue. I mean, with a name like that, you really didn't have many career options anyway. Now, we don't know about the first post rider's name, but we do know what happened to Governor Lovelace. Unfortunately, his obsession with starting America's postal system led to his professional demise. In the summer of 1673, Lovelace visited Winthrop in Hartford to discuss his mail system, the details of it, and while he was there discussing the very system that was supposed to protect New England against attack from the Dutch, well, who attacks Manhattan but the Dutch? And Lovelace is away during this. While he returns home, an urgent messenger intercepts him on his way back, tells him about the news, and Lovelace writes he's a very poetic man, Lovelace. He wrote a very heartfelt letter to Winthrop saying that the two men should meet again, if not here, then in the hereafter, which is much better. He sent the rider on to Hartford to give Winthrop the letter, and also instructed him to continue telling Boston of the news as well. Here we see a close-up of Lovelace's letter that he dashed off on the route. You see that the Dutch have approached before New York, but he did have time to really have quite a lovely signature. But this was the end of Francis Lovelace. It was not the end of the mail, but it was not good times for the mail. The early post office that Lovelace and Winthrop initiated did not do very well. Part of that was because of high prices. In 1693, it cost you 2 pence to send a letter overseas, but it cost you 6 pence to send it to Rhode Island from Boston, 9 to Connecticut, 12 to New York. You can see that it really wasn't cost efficient. Recipients, not senders, in that day paid for the letters. Doing so, they ended up racking up huge debts. You can imagine a postman coming up to you, "Oh, here's your letter. Oh, hey, sorry, buddy, I'll get you next time." So there were huge debts, and he paid these off 4 times a year, what they called quarter days. But when they didn't pay it off, postmaster had to pay for this out of his own pocket. He was rarely reimbursed by the colonies, even though he frequently petitioned for reimbursement. And the man who saved the postal system was none other than Ben Franklin. Now, I promised I would talk about only unknown American figures, and obviously Ben Franklin is not an unknown American figure, but his, I think, least known accomplishment of his many is his services to the post office. For instance, we see him here, Ben, and I have this action figure with the kite, but they don't sell one with a mail bag. Maybe the Postal Museum can help me out with that. But Franklin had very long roots on the Post Road. He was actually born right on the Post Road in Washington Street, on Washington Street, where it intersects with modern Milk Street, if you're familiar. And in 1753, he was made the Deputy Postmaster General of America. This was a position appointed by the throne. We all know that it is the job of general to, by God, get things done. And that's what Franklin did. He immediately set out on a lengthy tour of the Post Road that was unprecedented in just the way that Winthrop's tour of the early native trails was unprecedented. He examined the road, making special focus on the area between Boston and New York, not only because it had been the first mail route, but also because it was the highest volume letter traffic. He saw it was in complete disrepair. Between New York and New London, Connecticut, which is a distance of 125 miles, he didn't find a single post office, and there was no rider. It was supposed to go through Hartford some of the time and through Providence. The rest of the time, the rider didn't go through Hartford at all. Hartford had to pay some townsmen to go ride down to the coast whenever it wanted its mail. So Franklin begins to lay the groundwork for the modern postal system. He starts a post office immediately in New Haven, which was a critical cog, as you saw before, in the Northeast route. He designs very precise accounting tables that were organized by date and destination. He alphabetizes outgoing letters by surname. These sound like simple things now, but it's nothing that was being done at the time. He even creates home delivery option for an extra half penny. Now, this requires some explanation. At the time, there were no house addresses. The post rider wouldn't deliver a letter right to your door. He would take it to most often a tavern and just drop off the mail there. The rest of the time, if there was a print shop in town, only the bigger towns had print shops, but if there was a print shop, he would take it there. But Franklin said, hey, why not take it to their door for another half penny? He published the name of any mail that sat in these taverns or print shops for more than a month. He published your name in the newspaper, getting gear here and get down and get your letter. When they didn't pick it up eventually and the mail began to accumulate, he started what is still today known as the dead letter office, where we sent all the letters that were never claimed. He demanded that his post riders make no delays more than 15 minutes, even out of friendship or compliment to any person whatsoever. And it continues. He slashed the time of the New York to Boston mail from 2 weeks down to 4 days by demanding his post riders continue to ride even through the night. And he invented an odometer to help them measure the mileage between the distances. Again, the postage was done not by a flat fee, a flat rate, but by distance. And he laid milestones down as well. In fact, the only accomplishment Franklin came up with that wasn't a grand success was his rule that you had to blow your horn every 5 miles. And this kind of seems cruel to the horse. But in the end, Franklin was really the first one to make the post office profitable. He really got the throne interested in the American mail again, and it was through all these mechanisms we just described. The milestones that Franklin ordered the towns to put up have really become the icons of the Boston Post Road. If you go in the Northeast and mention Boston Post Road, you will the response will be, oh, I saw a mile marker here or there. You see one here embedded the side of the road. Some towns have moved them. They've been blown by wind and sand over time, so that they, a lot of times the names, the lettering is no longer there. So this town redid the lettering and showed 62 miles from Boston. This is part of a series of 19 consecutive milestones that exist in western Massachusetts, the longest string that still exists today. This one here is the 67 milestone from Boston. It also shows the mileage to Springfield, and it's favorite of mine because a young boy shot it with a .22 a couple of years ago. Target practice. In 1769, this milestone would have been on Manhattan, the 9 milestone. It's not there anymore. There's only 1 milestone left on Manhattan, I believe, and it's way up north in an area no one would go. There were a couple milestones in the Boston area before Franklin got his hands on the postal system. This one shows 8 miles to Boston, dates 1734. Still there today in Cambridge. It's in a graveyard right at Harvard Square, and it's a constant source of confusion to people there because Cambridge is only about 2 miles from Boston. So they say, why does it say 8 miles? Well, that just goes to show you how windy and inefficient some of the early Indian trails were. Again, because they had to go near the rivers and avoid all the hills. Now, Franklin also improved the way newspapers were sent. He believed they were a good public service. He said that they're on many occasions useful to government and advantageous to commerce and to the public. Now, the Post Road played a role in America's earliest newspapers as well. The very first regular newspaper, picture of it here, the Boston Newsletter, was printed right on the Boston Post Road in Washington Street by a man named John Campbell, who was the postmaster of New England. The first issue was in April of 1704 here. And there's a strong connection historically between printers and postmasters. Franklin himself was a printer as well as the postmaster. Many, like John Campbell, considered it their right to print a newspaper. They got news, gravitated kind of naturally to the post office. You had to come down to claim your letter, like I said, or to mail your letter. So he kind of heard the contents of the letters this way. He learned information this way. When the post rider would return back from his route, he would share any gossip he got along the route. And through this gossip and the printer's own subscriptions to London newspapers, the printer and the postmaster really became the Metro and World editor, and the local and foreign correspondent rolled into one. It's really a one-man media machine. And soon the Post Road, through the proliferation of newspapers, began to connect towns big and small with a common conversation, and by the eve of revolution, a common cause. There's a well-known anecdote of John Adams visiting a tavern in Shrewsbury, Massachusetts, which is 40 miles west of the Post Road. And when he stops in there, he overhears a conversation of people saying, well, if they can take away John Hancock's wharf, why can't they take away your barn? And it was this kind of dialogue between the city and the hinterland that really went to show the power of the colonial newspapers and the importance of the Post Road. Now, 4 Post Road newspapers in particular played a huge role in the escalation toward rebellion. The Connecticut Gazette began in New Haven. And one of the earliest things it did was speak out against the Stamp Act. Here's a picture of the Stamp Act here. The Stamp Act in 1765, this wasn't about stamps actually, it was actually about the type of paper you would print. The Connecticut Gazette comes out and rails against the Stamp Act with really vociferous, vengeful editorials, and in doing so they kind of try to intimidate this Stamp Act, and they do intimidate the governor of New York, Cadwallader Colden. The New York Gazette reprints a lot of these editorials, and in the day before the Stamp Act was set to go into existence, it prints a notice for a meeting on a tavern on the Post Road. At this tavern, people met and they stormed that fort that I told you about at the bottom of the Post Road and said, well, if you try to distribute the stamped paper, you've got it coming to you. And Colden backed down, and so did the rest of the stamp masters, stamp agents throughout the Northeast because of the newspapers. The Providence Gazette roused its patriots so much that in June of 1772 they attacked a British ship, the Gaspee. And they set fire to it and actually shot at it, and this is considered by many to be the first bloodshed of the Revolution. And of course, no rise to rebellion is complete without the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Gazette published word of the meeting that took place in the meeting house on the Post Road in December of 1773. It's actually the place where Ben Franklin was baptized, believe it or not. And at this meeting erupted the events that we know today as the Boston Tea Party. It's believed that the only complete roster of men to ever participate in the Tea Party was locked in the drawer of the editor of the Boston Gazette, Benjamin Eads. And the very next day after the Tea Party, Paul Revere rode a message to New York along the Post Road, signed by It was written by Samuel Adams. He just wanted to tell his friends, his fellow patriots in New York, about the, quote, interesting event that had occurred last night. When we finally did arrive at war, the Post Road broke that news as well. April 19th, 1775, fighting breaks out at Lexington, and while Paul Revere is writing into history, another writer named Israel Bissell is bringing this message here. It's called the Lexington Alarm, along the Boston Post Road from Watertown, Massachusetts, to spread word of the attack. He wrote, well, he didn't write, but he distributed the message that said, "To all friends of American liberty, be it known that this morning before break of day, a brigade consisting of about 1,000 or 1,200 men fired without any provocation on us." This letter made it through. It's signed by lots of towns on the Post Road: New London, New Haven, New York. By April 24th, it even makes it all the way down to Philadelphia, actually. It took the post roads that were below New York, and everyone knew that war had begun. Soon after the Lexington Alarm gets distributed, the Americans refused to use the British post office anymore. They cancel the British post riders, and they say we need to institute in a completely American system. And when they do this, they name, the Continental Congress names Benjamin Franklin the very first Postmaster General. Nice going, Ben. After the Revolution, we had mail on the post road, but we did not have very much travel, and that's because long-distance travel wasn't very pleasant at that time. Riding in this stagecoach, passengers would frequently bump their heads against the top of it. One writer at the time describes the post road as like staircases of rocks. When you went over these rocks, there was no spring suspension here, so you were thumped against the hard leather strap that kept the carriage upright, and when you had to go across the river, you put the entire carriage and all the horses and all the people inside on a ferry. You have to imagine there was a lot of praying going on at that moment. The man who really changed this state of affairs was a Post Road native named Levi Pease. He's from Enfield, Connecticut, which is right along the Connecticut River. He was a blacksmith and scoured the Northeast for goods to help Lafayette during the war. And when the war was over in October of 1783, he announced that he's going to start a long-distance stagecoach service on the Boston Post Road. Nobody thought he could do it, but Pease stuck with it, and he orchestrated a dependable week-long New York to Boston journey. He orchestrated the drivers, the tavern keepers, and even the blacksmiths. There were frequent breakdowns. You had to have all these pieces in place for a dependable journey, and Pease does this. That's him right there, by the way, if you don't recognize him. And in doing this, he really changes the speed of life in America. In 1786, Congress took notice of the success of Pease's stagecoach route, and it agreed to send the mail by coach. This was a big upgrade over Lone Rider. You could send more letters at a time here, and it changed the way mail and information was sent in America. By 1810, when he retires, Pease is known as the father of the New England roads, and his headstone still exists today, right in a cemetery right off the Boston Post Road. I guess he would be happy to know that. Stagecoach travel ruled the day until the middle of the 19th century, when the railroads finally emerged. Actually, people wanted to build canals before they built railroads. They wanted to copy the Erie Canal, and it was a man named Nathan Hale, the nephew of the famous patriot who died saying, "My only regret is I have one life to lose for my country," right before he was hung on the Boston Post Road, believe it or not, in Manhattan. His nephew told Boston, well, you guys should really try out this other technology I've been reading about. It's called the railroad, and he convinced them to do this, and in 1835 he made Boston into the first real railroad hub in the world. There were 3 lines that emanated out of Boston at that time. 2 of the tracks paralleled the Post Road directly, a track to Providence and a track west that would eventually go to Springfield and went through Worcester. The plans for these early railroads were directly inspired by the Post Road. The makers of these plans used stagecoach traffic along the route and also the routes themselves to plan out where the railroads would go. And by 1838, Congress notices this as well and says, okay, you can send the mail by railroad. We'll call railroads Post Roads 2. This is a map of 1860. It shows the railroads that would eventually parallel the Boston Post Road completely. You see by 1848 the inland route was paralleled by the railroad. This was best known as the Boston and Albany. And the coastal route was done 10 years later, 1858. This was best known as the New Haven Railroad, which became infamous. It was later sued by the government for being a monopoly. As great as railroads were, they caused us to overlook our more common roads. And by the late 19th century, the colonial road maintenance system that I discussed earlier, it was still in place. Every once or twice a year, every man in town would gather on parts of the road and do their best to kick big rocks to the side of the road and move the big branches that had fallen on the route. It really wasn't efficient at all. Most of the time apparently was spent drinking, gossiping, spontaneous foot races were the norm. As one writer at the time points out, this wasn't road maintenance at all. It was actually road destroying. There's a famous joke that was circulating around New England at the time. You see a hat lying in the middle of the road, and you stoop down to pick it up, and there's a person underneath, and he says, "Hold on a second, I've got a good horse down here somewhere." And by neglecting their road upkeep, New Englanders could continue telling that joke, as they liked to do. One of the big problems was that there was no federal oversight. There was no funding for road creation. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution grants you the right to establish post road, but there were debates about precisely what this meant. Did this mean just simply christen an already established route a post road, or did this mean give you money to create an entirely new road that would send the mail? And through these debates, many congressmen didn't want their states, Texas in particular was very loud against this legislation, to please cranks in the other states, notably the Northeast, by paying for road maintenance. So they had these debates on and off for many years. It's good to see that Congress hasn't changed much. The man who did eventually convince Congress that they needed to fund road construction was this man, Albert Pope. And he was actually a bicycle titan. A lot of people believe Henry Ford and the automobile industry was responsible for the good road system that we have today. No, it was a bicycle man, Albert Pope, and he was a post road native. In the early 1880s, he started a bike office right on Washington Street on the post road. He moved his operation to Hartford. A couple years later, called it the Pope Manufacturing Company. By 1900, he was so successful that the U.S. Census called him the father of the American bicycle. What he would often do is there was certainly no Google Maps, and there was even no printed maps really at this time, so he decided to print some maps, and he would show bike riders where they could go. They were going to spend their weekend on their bike, and often these routes used the old post road. But riders would write back to Pope and they'd say, "Look, I can't ride my bike on the old post road because it's full of rocks and it's in terrible condition." So Pope began to recognize the problem, and he threw his success and money at it. One of the first things he did was fund MIT's very first highway engineering program, and to get the scholarly interest in road construction going. And in 1893, it's really his efforts lobbying Congress that lead to what was then called the Office of Road Inquiry. It was a very small office, about $10,000 given to it in a line item in an annual budget, but it has grown today in what we know as the Federal Highway Administration. When the road was ready for automobiles, the post road played a role in the early car industry as well. This is the Frank Durier's car that he built, and it's considered the first modern gasoline car in America's history. It was built right in Springfield, about a block or so off where the post road ran through that town. This finely mustachioed gent is Hiram Percy Maxim, and he was one of the chief engineers of the early automotive day. The early automotive center of the world, and certainly of America, was Hartford. And Maxim worked in Hartford, and he would do test drives of his early creations of automobiles. He would test drive it right on the Boston Post Road. Now, he had to do this at night because he brought out the cars during the day. Half of Hartford would stop working and come gather around and look at these very strange contraptions. They were wild to people. People thought they were derailed trains. They were so loud at times. And in 1898, Maxim makes his most impressive test ride. It's a drive along the old post road from Hartford all the way to New York City. He terrifies several other carriage drivers and horses along the way. He gets lost a few times himself, and when he does finally pull into Manhattan, he confronts a problem that many still find in Manhattan today. He couldn't find parking. That's because no one would allow him to put this strange contraption in front of their building. They thought it was going to explode. And on his way home, actually did kind of explode. The engine dropped straight off the chassis, and that was the end of the test drive for Mr. Maxim. When car travel did come of age, we needed a good numbered national road system, so the federal government sent this map, it's a 1922 automobile map, to all the heads of public works in the various states, and this is the one that the Massachusetts head sent back, and he clearly indicates that you can't see so much the highlighting on this copy, but he clearly indicates that the coastal and northern branch of the post roads are going to be his main thoroughfares. They would become, we know this one, the lower coastal route today is US Route 1. You can even see here, if you look, they were calling it Route 1. And the early route between Boston and Springfield was initially called Route 5, but it later came Route 20. Sorry to say, they did not call it US Route 1 because the Boston Post Road had been the very first mail route. Actually, the first mail route would have gone up north through 20. They called it 1 because the best system they could devise was that north-south roads would be odd numbers, east-west ones would be even. You couldn't have numbers that were too similar near each other. It was a very complicated and long debate that's incredibly boring. Between the world wars and really in the early half of the 20th century, really up to the start of the interstate highway system, the Interstate Highway Act in 1956, the Boston Post Road, in particular US 1, becomes the nation's road standard. It's included in an exhibit of the world's most famous roads right alongside Germany's Bergstrasse, England's Watling Street, and the Appian Way of the Roman Empire. We had a cruising lifestyle emerge in the Roaring 20s. Celebrities like Zelda and Scott Fitzgerald would take what they called mad rides along the Post Road from their home life in Connecticut to their nightlife in Manhattan. FDR Jr. was frequently ticketed for doing 80 on the Post Road as he made his way back to Harvard. The Post Road made news when airplanes flew the mail over this first American postal route for the first time in 1926. During this era, there's a writer from Life magazine who is anticipating something called television, and he's very excited about this because it will welcome the chance to view sporting events like the Harvard-Yale game, quote, without risking life and limb on the Boston Post Road. That's because the Post Road was really choked with traffic back in that day. Couldn't keep up with it at all. The first response was to widen lanes, but that was very expensive because people had made their properties abutting the Post Road because so much traffic went through it. So they tried to build what they called parkways. The first ones were inspired by the traffic on the Post Road. Again, this didn't work because parkways weren't well equipped to handle the speed of automobiles, which increased greatly in a very small amount of time. So they ultimately settled on having to construct an entirely new type of road. It would separate lanes for different speeds. It would have medians that completely separated the directions of traffic. It would have no traffic lights, but instead on and off ramps, and you know them now as the expressway. A lot of the expressways directly parallel the Post Road. 95 goes along the coast all the way to Boston. 90 sticks pretty close to the old Post Road. The northern route, and this is no accident, the Post Road directly inspired these expressways, in particular 95. And 95, the strip between New York and New Haven was built before the Interstate Highway Act because, like I said, traffic was so bad they simply didn't have another option. Told you about that proposal FDR fielded in 1931 about expressways. Well, Robert Moses kind of took the bull by the horn and began to build an expressway in New York in the 1940s, and he pushed his expressway all the way up to the Connecticut line. Connecticut said, no, you got to stop the road. But Moses said, well, I'm going to stop it right at the Connecticut border. Then what are you going to do? All the cars are going to be there, and they're going to have nowhere to go, and it's going to be disaster. So the big mad Moses won out. But at that time, this road that he created wasn't even called I-95. These names didn't come into existence until after the Highway Act. It was actually called Relocation of U.S. Route 1. That was the project's name. So you have to ask whether the Post Road has become a lost highway as it lost its status here in the expressway era. A lot of the towns have relegated the Post Road, which used to be their main avenue, to a glorified local street. It's also very hard for us to know today which version of the post road to consider the true version of it. Is it the one where the Indians kind of stamped down the grass on their way from A to B through the wilderness, or is it the one that became Route 1? It's hard to know. Also, the original Boston Post Road purpose has changed over time. The name Boston Post Road was never really the name of a road at all. It was really a poetic description of where are you going? I'm going to Boston. What are you doing? I'm taking the post. How are you getting there? I'm going by road. I'm not going by sea. Of course, in the digital age, you have to wonder whether this purpose, again, has eroded. And last, it's very confusing to follow and track the post road because it takes many different names in many different places. If you go to Manhattan and you want to find the post road, you got to go to Bowery. You got to end up cutting up to St. Nicholas Avenue. Sometimes it's called Route 1. Some places call it the old post road. In Hartford and Providence, you got to find Main Street. And as I mentioned, in Boston, you got to find Washington Street. It's very difficult to, you need to sweep back throughout all of history to connect these pieces and really see that they are pieces of the same puzzle. So why is it important to do? Is it important to do? Why not just say, this is not my problem? Well, I'll give you an anecdote to respond to that. And in the mid-1960s, when they were building the final stretch of I-95 here between New York and Boston, it took place in eastern Connecticut. And to inaugurate the completion of this final stretch between New York and Boston, they sent a vehicle down I-95, but it was not our most technologically advanced vehicle to reflect our most technologically advanced road. It was, in fact, a stagecoach. And it was the governors of the states were sitting in the carriage along with some other big shots. Some of them were even dressed up in colonial costumes. Probably horsemen who were on I-95 before there was tire marks at this particular point. And it was done, as the New York Times wrote, to call to mind the post-road predecessor of I-95. This is a very interesting little event if you really stop to think about it. And what you discover as you begin to investigate the stories along this corridor, along the post road, and you talk to the people who live along it, you discover that even though it's important to embrace the new ways, it's also equally important to acknowledge the old ways. It's not to say that they want to drive stagecoaches on I-95 necessarily, though it might be faster sometimes. But it is to say that if parts of this identity were lost, they would feel that part of their own identity were lost too. And that's certainly true of people in the Northeast. It's probably true of students of postal history as well. So I will give you a parting slide of the parting stone. This is the stone that directed riders in Boston either south toward Rhode Island. On this side of the stone it says toward Rhode Island, or west toward Springfield. On this side it says toward Springfield. And it still stands today in Roxbury, Massachusetts, just outside Boston at the corner of Center and Roxbury Streets if you're ever visiting there. And believe it or not, it is lodged right up against an auto parts store. So thank you much. I'll take questions.
What's at the very bottom of the stone, underneath 1741?
So this is actually 1744, and this was one of those series of stones that preceded Franklin. Like I said, Boston was very aware of the need to place down these milestones, and that's P. Dudley, and he was the man who decided, well, we've got to start laying them down along Washington Street. They were along the east side of Washington Street. This would have been the third stone once you left the old State House at the end of Washington Street and State Street today. The old State House still stands there. You can go visit it. There's not much to do there. But if you walk along Washington Street and you have an odometer or something, you will see that you've gone 2 miles, 3 miles by the time you reach the parting stone. It tells you which way to go from there. Oh, yeah, sure. Because it's being cast on the web, she wants the questions to go through the microphone, so I'll give her a second here.
Thank you. At the end of your book, you talk about traveling with somebody named Red Ryder.
Red Ryder.
Thought you might want to elaborate on that journey.
Red Ryder was the name I gave to the first post rider. Before I found that letter that talked about Edward Messenger, you got to give a got to give him some kind of name, or else you're just saying the first rider all the time. So I called him Red Ryder because I'm ill, and that made it into the book. And we now know that it's probably, or at least possibly, Edward Messenger. We may never know the name of the first American post rider. Yes? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, very quickly, this is about a segment of the post road, obviously, northeast. What about the rest of the country at that time?
Sure.
Because during the Revolution, Washington and all those guys were making trips north and south frequently.
Yeah. Well, any road that would carry the mail was officially called a post road. This was true for anywhere in America. If the mail went on this road, it was called a post road. What's different about this section is that it was, of course, the first postal route, and it has these incarnations that precede and antedate and postdate the post road era. And so you see afterward it becomes U.S. Route 1, and a lot of people know U.S. Route 1, but they don't even know that it was a post road at all. They know it as its own kind of iconic existence, and it's kind of Main Street to a lot of people. Anyone else? You're free to ask me questions as I'll be signing. Oh, yeah, sure.
What prompted your interest in the road?
That is probably the question I get most frequently. And when I'm from D.C., and when you're from D.C., you don't learn about the Boston Post Road, at least I didn't. But you do learn about things like the Oregon Trail and Route 66. I mean, you know there are important American roads, but it's not until you go to the Northeast, as I did, and was in New York one day and saw there's still a Boston Road in the Bronx. I was talking with someone earlier who lived right along it. And when you find that out and you learn that it was the first postal route in America's history, you kind of got to question why you didn't learn this coming from somewhere that wasn't the Northeast. When you do this, you soon find that there's a lot of history nobody's really talked about. Again, thank you so much for coming on a nice day outside. And I'm happy to answer questions later on, too.